The morning of November 3, 1943 began like most mornings at the German anti-aircraft battery outside Cologne, quietly, and with cold. Klaus Brandt pulled on his coat before the sun had fully risen. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear but from years of learning to manage it. He had served with the Luftwaffe's ground forces since 1940. He had stood at his post through dozens of Allied bombing raids. He had watched enormous formations of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers pass overhead like slow, thundering clouds, and he had helped send fire up into that sky until his hands shook from the vibration of the guns. He was not a man who frightened easily. But on this particular morning, as the horizon began to glow and his crew took their positions around the massive 88mm anti-aircraft gun, Brandt felt something he could not quite name. It was not the heavy bombers he was thinking about. It was something smaller. Something faster. Something that, unlike the bombers, could choose to come directly for him. To understand what Brandt feared, it helps to understand what the war in the sky actually looked like by 1943. The German anti-aircraft forces, known as Flak, from the German word Flugabwehrkanone, meaning aircraft defense cannon, were among the most organized and disciplined fighting units in the world. By the middle of the war, more than 1 million German men and women served in the Flak arm alone. They operated in coordinated batteries, with each crew trained to perform a specific task. One man read the rangefinder, another adjusted the elevation, another calculated the speed and direction of incoming aircraft, and the rest loaded and fired. The whole process, repeated again and again under the noise of battle, was designed to function like a precise machine. And against high-altitude bombers, it worked extremely well. When a formation of American B-17s flew at 25,000 feet, nearly 5 miles above the ground, the Flak crews had time to calculate. They could measure the formation's speed and direction, predict where it would be in 10 or 15 seconds, and fire their shells into that predicted space. The bombers flew in straight, disciplined lines. They did not weave or dive. They held their course, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. Against this kind of target, the Flak battery was a serious and deadly weapon. What no one had trained the Flak crews to handle was a single, fast fighter aircraft, flying below 500 feet, coming straight at them at over 350 miles per hour. The P-51 Mustang arrived in the European theater in late 1943, and it changed everything. Before the Mustang, American fighter escorts could only accompany bombers partway into German territory before running low on fuel and turning back. This left the bombers alone and vulnerable deep inside enemy airspace. The Mustang, with its external fuel tanks and remarkably efficient engine, could fly all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, American bombers had protection for the entire journey. But the Mustang, and its companion the P-47 Thunderbolt, brought something else to the war. They brought a new type of pilot. These men were young, most of them in their early 20s, drawn from every corner of the United States. They had gone through rigorous training programs, learned to fly in the flat plains of Texas and the mountains of California, and arrived in England ready to fight. They were aggressive by nature and by training. They understood the mission: protect the bombers, keep them safe from German fighter aircraft, bring them home. But after the bombers were safe, after the escort duty was done and the formation was heading back toward England, some of those pilots looked down at the German countryside below them and made a decision. They decided to go hunting. The official term was targets of opportunity. By 1944, American commanders had formally authorized fighter pilots to attack ground targets once their primary escort duty was complete. Rail lines, fuel depots, airfields, convoys of vehicles, anything that contributed to the German war effort was fair game. The idea was simple: if the fighters had fuel and ammunition left, why waste the return trip? What made this so dangerous for men like Brandt was that the Flak battery itself was a target of opportunity. When a Flak gun opened fire on a passing formation of American bombers, it revealed its position. The flash from the barrel, the smoke rising from the muzzle, the pattern of bursting shells in the sky, all of it could be seen from the air. And if there was an American fighter pilot nearby who had finished his escort duty and was looking for something to engage, a firing Flak battery was very easy to find. This created a terrible choice for the Flak crews. If they fired at the bombers, they risked drawing attention to themselves. If they stayed quiet, they failed their mission. Most of the time, duty won. They fired. And sometimes, minutes later, something would peel away from the edges of the bomber formation high above and begin to descend. Captain James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group described the experience of a strafing run in his own words, recorded in a post-war account. He said it was nothing like the movies. There was no slow, graceful dive. The approach happened in seconds. The pilot dropped the nose of the aircraft, pushed the throttle forward, and the ground rushed up at a speed that left almost no time to think. The target, a gun emplacement, a vehicle, a building, appeared as a small shape that grew rapidly until it filled the windscreen. The pilot fired in that final moment, pulled back hard on the stick, and then the target was gone, replaced by sky. From the ground, it looked entirely different. For the Flak crew, there was first a sound, a high, rising engine note that did not match the deep rumble of the heavy bombers they knew so well. Then the aircraft appeared, not above them where they were trained to look, but at the horizon, low and moving with shocking speed. The standard 88mm anti-aircraft gun was built to elevate toward the sky. Rotating it downward to track a low-flying aircraft was slow and awkward. The traversing mechanism, built for the slow, predictable movement of high-altitude bombers, could not keep pace with a fighter diving across the ground. By the time the crew had moved the gun even halfway toward the approaching aircraft, the aircraft was already past. Or it was not. And that was worse. In the spring of 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group, an American unit based in England and known informally by a nickname that reflected their reputation for aggression, conducted a sweep over central Germany after escorting a bombing mission to the Magdeburg region. The bombers were safely on their way home. The fighters had fuel remaining. Their flight leader, scanning the ground below, spotted the smoke signature of a flak battery that had been firing at the departing bomber formation. He rocked his wings, the signal to his wingmen, and pushed forward on the stick. What followed lasted less than 90 seconds by most estimates. The American aircraft came in from the northwest, using the angle of the sun to make themselves harder to spot until the last moment. The Flak crew, which had been tracking the departing bombers and had not yet repositioned their gun, heard the engines before they saw anything. 3 men attempted to rotate the 88mm toward the incoming aircraft. The elevation of the barrel, still angled high from its previous firing position, could not be adjusted quickly enough. The other crew members scattered toward their prepared shelter positions, not in panic, but because their training, correctly, told them that in this situation, the shelter was the only logical place to be. The guns did not fire a single round in response. When it was over, 2 of the battery's 3 gun positions were damaged beyond immediate repair. The ammunition storage area was burning. Of the 12 men in the crew, 4 had minor injuries from flying debris. The crew's fire control equipment, the careful range-finding instruments that made them so effective against high-altitude targets, had been destroyed completely. They were not defeated soldiers. They were skilled men whose equipment had simply been designed for a different kind of fight. What made the American fighter pilots so difficult to counter was not just their speed. It was their unpredictability. A formation of bombers followed a route. It had a direction, an altitude, a predictable behavior. The Flak crews could set up their calculations before the bombers even came into range. They knew, roughly, what was coming. A fighter pilot following his own instincts was a different matter entirely. He might come from any direction. He might dive steeply or approach in a shallow glide. He might make one pass and continue home, or he might circle and come back from a different angle. He might be alone or he might be one of 6, each approaching from a different point of the compass. The crew had no way to know. Every decision they made, stay at the gun or take cover, rotate left or right, elevate or lower the barrel, was a guess. German commanders recognized the problem. By mid-1944, new instructions were being issued to flak batteries in areas frequently targeted by American fighter sweeps. Batteries were told to camouflage their positions more carefully between firing. Dummy positions, empty gun emplacements built to look real from the air, were constructed nearby to draw attention away from the actual guns. Crews were drilled on rapid dispersal procedures. Small-caliber anti-aircraft weapons, which could be moved and aimed more quickly than the heavy 88mm guns, were assigned to protect the batteries. None of these measures fully solved the problem. They managed it. There is a difference. The pilots who conducted these missions were not without danger themselves. This is an important part of the truth. Strafing, the term for attacking ground targets from low altitude, was among the most dangerous things a fighter pilot could do. At low altitude, every person on the ground with any kind of firearm became a threat. A rifle, a machine gun mounted on a vehicle, even a soldier with a pistol could, under the right circumstances, strike a low-flying aircraft. Larger anti-aircraft weapons designed specifically for low-altitude targets, the German 20mm and 37mm cannons, were far more effective against fighters than the heavy 88mm guns were. American records show that more pilots were lost to ground fire during strafing missions than in any other type of offensive operation. Some experienced pilots flatly considered it the most dangerous assignment they could receive. The odds of being struck by ground fire during a low-level attack were significant. The odds of surviving that strike, given the low altitude and high speed involved, were considerably lower than they would have been at higher altitude. The pilots who went down anyway knew the risk. Some of them went because their commanders expected it. Some went because they had watched friends fall from the sky due to flak fire, and they wanted to silence those guns. Some went because they were 22 years old and genuinely believed nothing could stop them. Human motivation in war is rarely simple, and it was not simple here. What is clear is that they went. By the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the pattern had become established enough that German prisoner interrogation records, conducted by Allied intelligence teams and now preserved in archives, show a consistent theme. Flak crew members, when asked about their experiences, frequently distinguished between raids by heavy bombers and attacks by fighter aircraft. The bombers, many of them said, were frightening but comprehensible. You could see them coming from a great distance. You had time to prepare. You fired, they dropped their bombs, the raid ended, and you assessed the damage. There was a certain terrible rhythm to it. The fighters were different. Several men used almost identical language without having spoken to each other. They described the fighter attacks as feeling personal. As if the pilot had specifically chosen them. As if, among all the targets in Germany on that particular afternoon, one man had looked down, seen them, and decided that they were the ones he was coming for. Rationally, they understood this was not true. The pilot did not know their names. He probably could not see their faces from his cockpit. He was attacking a military position, not a collection of individuals. But the feeling remained. And feelings, in the psychology of soldiers under sustained pressure, matter enormously. Brandt survived the war. He returned to Cologne in 1945 and spent the following decades working as a railway administrator. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, the way many men of his generation did not. In 1971, a West German journalist collecting oral histories of the war found him through a veterans network and persuaded him to speak on the record. The interview, conducted over 2 afternoons at Brandt's kitchen table, covered his entire time in the Flak Arm, the training, the early raids, the long months in the Ruhr Valley, the final chaotic months of 1945. Near the end of the second afternoon, the journalist asked him what he feared most during the war. Brandt was quiet for a moment. He looked out the kitchen window at the street where his grandchildren played after school. He said that against the bombers, a man could feel like part of a system. You were one element in a very large machine, and they were one element in an even larger machine, and the two machines were working against each other at enormous distances, with mathematics and technology standing between you and them. It was frightening, but it had a kind of order to it. You knew what you were doing. You knew what they were doing. Everything followed rules. The fighters, he said, did not follow rules. They followed decisions. One man, in one aircraft, decided to leave the formation above him and come down to where you were standing. That one man, at that one moment, chose you. And there was nothing in your training, nothing in your equipment, and nothing in your experience that fully prepared you for what it meant to be chosen like that. The journalist asked if he thought about those pilots now, all these years later. Brandt smiled, not a bitter smile, the journalist noted, but a thoughtful one. He said yes. He thought they were brave men. He thought they must have known how dangerous it was to come down that low. He said he bore them no hatred. The war had made enemies of people who, in other circumstances, would have had nothing against each other at all. But, he added, he was glad none of them had found his battery on the wrong morning. The story of the German flak crews and the American fighter pilots is, at its core, a story about two different kinds of war meeting each other in the same sky. The Flak crews represented the industrial, systematic side of modern conflict, organized, disciplined, working from calculations and procedures. They were very good at what they had been built to do. Against the slow, predictable movements of high-altitude bombers, they were genuinely formidable. Thousands of Allied airmen lost their lives to flak fire over Europe, and the men who operated those guns deserve to be understood as serious and capable soldiers. The American fighter pilots, particularly during their low-level operations, represented something older: individual decision-making, personal initiative, the single man acting on his own judgment in a fast-moving situation. This was not a better or worse way to fight. It was simply a different one. And in the specific context of a fighter bearing down on a flak position at low altitude, it was a way that the flak crews, with all their training and discipline, had no reliable answer for. The fear that men like Brandt felt was not weakness. It was the rational response of a skilled professional encountering a problem that his skills, through no fault of his own, had not been designed to solve. That is one of the oldest and most honest lessons of war, that being trained, disciplined, and capable is not always enough. Sometimes the fight simply changes around you, and what you were built for is no longer what you are facing. The men on both sides of that equation, the flak crews at their guns and the fighter pilots descending toward them, were doing what their countries had asked them to do, as well as they knew how, in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. They deserved to be remembered honestly, without false glory and without simplification. The fear was real. The courage on both sides was real. And the reality of what they faced, in those few terrible seconds between the sound of an engine and the silence that followed, was as real as anything in the history of that long and costly war. Based on documented historical accounts, European Theater of Operations, 1943 to 1945.